Hi, everybody. I realize I'm the one standing between you and whatever happy hour exists or commute home, and so I promise not to use the full half an hour, though I do promise to give the summary of the day. And one of the first things that I wanted to do was give kudos to all the presenters today, and especially, you guys clapped too early. I was not even done thanking people. I want to give Deb and Andrew a lot of credit for pulling together the agenda, because I think the agenda not only was strong, the self-clap, Andrew, is very good, but it also helps to tell a story. And that's kind of what I want to close on today as a theme here in the last 5 to 10 minutes. And as we reflect back on the panel, we had 5 panels today. We opened with a health and employment panel. We then had an employment trends panel, which set what I consider to be the context for the employment policy research. As the third panel, right before lunch, we heard from Untitled, which is really about dissemination. And the fourth and fifth panels were, that we just heard about this afternoon, were really about interventions and lessons from intervention development of sort of where we could go. So it's really the context, the dissemination, and where can we go going forward. And so what should be some of the punchlines that we should take from today? And here are some of the things, at least the world according to Dave, of what I took away from today. First of all, one of the connective themes is that there's a cautiously optimistic set of outcomes and data. And during my research career, I haven't gotten to be very optimistic often, and so I like the idea of actually leading with that with a punchline. And one of the studies that was source of optimism is when you look at Andrew's work and looking at the employment trends. There's been some real progress. Now, mind you, this progress is from the depths of the employment rates, but the employment rates have increased over the past few years from 24 to 28, or 28 to 29%, which is a fairly large number. And so there has been some benefits from the recent expansion. As you think about the health insurance papers from the opening session, I know there's a lot of focus on, well, which one is right? How should we think about this? But taking a step back, one of the very first things that should really strike you immediately is when you look at the ACA and you look at the uninsurance rates. The uninsurance rates dropped from 21% to 11%. According to Judy. That is a very large number for people with disabilities. And there is evidence from other demonstrations that have randomly tested the provision of health insurance, the Oregon health insurance experiment, and the accelerated benefits demonstration. And these experiments show, here's what happens when you provide health insurance to an uninsured population. Some of the things we may want to look at are similar to what we looked at there, which is their health outcomes improved quite a bit. And interestingly, from both randomized study, there's very mixed evidence on employment unless you combine it with other supports. Moving along to some of the other themes, as we move towards the noontime theme, and we look to the Untitled series, in my 20 years, the access to disability data has increased substantially. And that's not only due to the compendium, which you're going to see tomorrow, but it's actually due to these efforts through the webinars, and it's through the lunch series of how do we get better. And Elaine and John talked about how we're discussing data and how we're disseminating data. And there are ways that I'm sure that we're doing well, and there are probably ways that we can do better. And hopefully we learned both about that today. Another positive punchline is on the interventions side, and this was the discussion today, this afternoon. So when you look at Sally Rogers' presentation, you really got to see some very positive and repeated effects, particularly from the IPS model for people with psychiatric impairments. When you look at Yanni's presentation about early intervention, you see the early potential for early intervention amongst different populations and providing the right supports. And that plays into some of the much more bigger picture ideas from Reagan and Dave about how how to refine and reform the system at a much broader level, and using ideas from the VA program as well as the EES that Dave talked about. And then in the afternoon session, Tim talked about how to think about interventions from positive side, about inclusivity and how those simple concepts of making sure that people with disabilities are included in all aspects of the management decisions are important in developing an environment that promotes employment. I'm going to come back to that point in a moment. And finally, Elaine just mentioned in her talks about how CEOs like Randy Lewis are actually going to other companies and creating the networking in order to set up environments to improve the employment outcomes of people with disabilities. So this is all positive stuff, and it's an economist here at a closing remark saying positive stuff. So this is unusual for me. So, but of course there's problems. What are some of the themes of the problems that we heard today? And perhaps the number one theme that we heard sort of throughout, embedded through some of these discussions, was the concern about job quality. Megan gave a presentation that highlighted the issues around job quality in terms of wage, in terms of satisfaction, in terms of other measures of safety of work, in terms of still measuring some of what some of the disparities are there. Even in Sally's optimistic presentation about supported employment, one of the punchlines is that the impacts, while significant, statistically significant, have not been substantive enough to move people from SSDI to long-term employment without program dependency. And then Francis and Nathan also talked about what I will call the human picture of people with disabilities, where they talked about, in particular, David, who was the scuba diver, who wanted to work more but felt the practical constraints of the issues of SSDI. And this is also another point. I'm going to come back on both the qualitative findings from that study as well as Tim. And then there are two final problems that I've seen that were echoed, particularly in Dave Stapleton's presentation, about the Herculean task of making change. And there's another sort of subtle issue that Leslie and I were sort of chatting about, which is the own self-perception of whether change is needed. And as you look at John O'Neill's presentations, one of the things that you see is 96% of employers think that they have effective practices. Well, if you think your process is effective, that can be a hindrance to developing interventions and experimentation. And that's a very, very important point. And so the question is, where do we go next? Because it can kind of feel like we're between a rock and a hard place in terms of developing new intervention supports and figuring out what are the interventions that sort of matters the most, and how do we get people to do those interventions? And here, Kim, I'm going to go with another quote here because, I like quotes. And some of you may have heard this in some of my presentations, but this is Kaiser Fung, who is a statistician, wrote a book called Numbers Rule Your World. And what I like about this quote is it juxtaposes the title about how numbers influence so many of the things that we do in our daily life with how to disseminate evidence. And what Dr. Fung writes is, successful applied scientists develop a feel for decision-making processes. Crucially, they repackage their logic-laced message to impress their ideas on those who are more comfortable with intuition or emotion than evidence. So this is really, really important because a lot of times we think all we have to do is bring evidence to the debate. But if people are not comfortable with the evidence, or they're not ready to receive the evidence, or simply do not understand it, the evidence won't be effective. And this is where I want to come back to sort of the qualitative messages, particularly from Nathan and Francis, and when they were talking about their stories today of people with disabilities, of David, Angelica, Jackie, and Jesse. The messages that we can take from them is a lot of the innovations that you heard from these qualitative stories were incredible ideas of the person's own amazing both self-experimentation but also innovation. You think about the person that, I think it was Jackie, that was the person that was figuring out how to do the RX testing and holding down a very well-paying job, which is amazing, going from job to job, and that innovation really matters. And so that's where I'm going to conclude with, which is not sort of a summary of econometric principles or things that we should do, but rather to focus on the messaging and the knowledge management as we go from these meetings and we think about what is next in employment policy. And at least in sort of my ideal world, the ideal is to be taking a look at all of our interventions and all of our programs and policies and testing them with an open mind. And I think there are 3 ingredients for that. The first ingredient, which is clarity, making sure that we have a clear stance of where we want to go. Employment matters. Making sure that that is carried through not just to policymakers, but to the people that are providing the services, to the people that are getting paid for the services, and to ultimately the people that are getting those services. Would people say that the purpose of, say, the rehabilitation support they're getting is to improve employment? And so clarity is one ingredient. The second ingredient is just simply humility, and here is something that I give Tim credit for, and actually, Tim, I'm going to give you credit in the next one. Sorry, this is not yours. the humility is knowing that you might fail. This is my take of why we need to test, because we don't know what will work necessarily, and going in not knowing with the answers, but actually coming out with asking the right questions. And this doesn't matter whether you're a researcher, a manager, or if you're simply a parent of trying to figure out what works. And finally, engagement. And this is the point that I do want to end with, because I was very struck by Tim's presentations. And the reason why I was struck by Tim's presentation was that he engaged the audience, and he asked the questions of the audience. And it, for at least me, was better than a cup of coffee, because I started to lean in. But it's sort of a subtle lesson of asking the right questions and leading people to figuring out so that they can adopt those ideas. And at least for me, Tim, one of the things I found immediately from my own personal perspective was I started leaning in because you were convincing me your ideas were my ideas, which is kind of one of the ways that we want to make change. And so on that important note, I would kind of like to end this conference. And Andrew, do I turn it over to you to talk about tomorrow, or do I just wrap up? I'm sorry.
I don't know.
We're experimenting.
Thank you, David. At least one person was paying attention the whole day. It's always good to hear Dave's comments. He's done this a few years in a row, and it's always good to hear. Tomorrow we start with the compendium. We have our new annual report as well. They're available outside if you're not coming back. If you're coming back, we'll see you again tomorrow. I think registration is at 8:30. That's what I'm hearing. And so thank you all for coming. Where's Dr. Brucker? Are you going to say goodbye to everybody, Deb? She says goodbye. Deb Brucker says goodbye to everybody online and everybody in the room. And thanks, everybody, for coming. Bye-bye.